There are anti-bullying weeks this month, resources and time spent telling our children not to bully and to stand up against those who do. Here now to help us get started, Deborah Pepler, Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Psychology at York University, and Anthony Voke, Developmental Psychologist and Associate Professor of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University in St. Catharines. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Deborah, I want to start with you. This is a topic that's discussed amongst experts by yourself, but increasingly at homes, around dinner tables, at workplaces, amongst friends. I've had many conversations about bullying. Tonight we are going to look at bullying sort of big picture, but I want to start with a close-up. Whether we're talking about kids or adults, what is bullying?
Well, we understand it as a problem in relationships, and it's when one person in a relationship has power for some reason over another and uses that power and aggression to cause distress or to control that other individual.
We hear of all kinds of situations. There's a power dynamic in most relationships. So where do you draw the line? What's bullying and what's not?
It's very hard to draw that line, and it has to do with the intent and whether the intent is aggressive and whether the individual experiencing the behavior finds it aggressive. And something that may be hurtful to one person might be perceived as a joke by another, and something when it's done only once might be funny, but after the 100th time, it's really hurtful to be called a name.
Okay, Tony, you want to add anything to that definition?
No, I think Deborah nailed it pretty much. It's a broad definition that isn't easy to nail down, which is part of why bullying is a complicated issue to study.
And it's also complicated because, as Deborah pointed out, what one person might consider bullying, another says, that's not bullying. I mean, is that part of the difficulty in even sort of having this discussion that we're going to have tonight, that we might all be talking about slightly different things?
I think the specifics can certainly become tricky to deal with. As we've mentioned, it's what could be bullying to one individual might not be to another. So when it comes time to trying to get a common definition, we have to rely on a basic definition that doesn't always fit every situation. So we have to be flexible in how we define bullying.
Okay, I want to address one other big question, which is this. You know, you always hear people saying, well, when I was in school, there was no bullying, or when I was in school, we didn't call this bullying. And I'm wondering, is today, in 2012, is it that bullying is everywhere? Is it really on the rise, or is it that we're just paying more attention to it?
Well, I've looked at historical data as well as cross-cultural data, everything from hunter-gatherers to ancient Rome to medieval Europe to modern times, and bullying's omnipresent. You find it everywhere that you look for it. The forms and its functions aren't always the same, but there is always, at every level that you look at it, you find power imbalances that are being exploited in violent ways to take advantage of the victim. So whether or not it's newer or higher, it's certainly not new. And whether it's higher is something we don't know because it really hasn't been studied for very long as a proper definition.
What do you think, Deborah? Do you think it's on the rise?
No, I agree with Tony that we're talking about it more. There's much more awareness. We're labeling things now as bullying that wouldn't have been labeled 20, 30 years ago. The primary difference is there's a new medium through which children can bully, and that's electronic means, whether it's texting or Facebook or other media. And it turns out it's the same children involved in traditional forms of bullying who've moved to this other medium for bullying. And the same children who are victimized in traditional ways are victimized in this new way that's much more removed from adult supervision. And there are many fewer rules in cyberspace than there are.
We are going to talk a lot about cyberspace as we move on through this discussion, but I want to stay with one more generality, and it is this. We have all heard the very tragic stories of teens like Amanda Todd, Jamie Hubley in Ottawa, both teens who took their own lives in the past year who attributed it to being bullied. Tragic, heartbreaking, but also I think arguably the extremes. And what I mean by that is that there is bullying all over the place. 4-year-old kids are bullying and being bullied, 10-year-old kids, same thing. So the question a lot of critics sort of say, or I don't want to say critics, but some people say, you know what? It's really just about kids being kids, and kids can be mean. And this is just about normal childhood development. What do you say to that?
Well, there are parts of it that are normal childhood development, and the normal part of it is that we all test our power and how we use our power and whether we're using it positively or negatively. Many children, when they use their power negatively and hurt someone, very quickly learn that that's not all right, that that's not the way to create healthy relationships and to move on. And in our research, we studied students from the time they were in grades 5, 6, and 7 through 7 years of high school and when they were in the final years of high school. And the children who bully at a high rate through those years move into physical aggression with their dating partners. They're much more likely to sexually harass. They're much more likely to be delinquent. So it's associated with many developmental problems that aren't normal, that aren't a part of what we would want young people to pursue as they grow up.
Tony, help me out here. Normal childhood behavior or something different?
Yeah, you know, I look at bullying from an evolutionary lens. So the idea is that this is something that is normative in the sense that you find it everywhere. And it seems that there are adaptive reasons for doing it. There are genetic predispositions that are tied to being bullying. And we also
like what?
Well, we know that, for example, a lot of personality traits that have a genetic component to them are predictive of being a bully or not. I mean, not a perfect predictive, a couple. Well, we know that agreeableness is important. Honesty and humility is a very good predictor of bullying. Psychopathic traits obviously are a good predictor of bullying. And what's more is that bullying is an advantage for the kids who do it. Now, just because something is natural doesn't mean we necessarily want it. We know that men are built to be more aggressive. We know that humans engage in war. There's a long history of primates engaging in war. That doesn't mean that men are allowed to go around and use violence to solve their problems, or that as societies we think wars are a good way of solving problems. So even though it may be natural, that doesn't mean it's something that we necessarily want to accept. Just like it may be natural for kids to want to eat nothing but peanut butter and chocolate all day, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing for children's development.
Okay. I want to talk about this relationship between bully and victim. And I wonder, and I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Deborah, is it black and white? Is it that kid over there, you know, kid A is the bully and kid B is the victim? Is it as black and white as that?
It's not, and a good example is girls' groups. In girls' groups, one person may be particularly popular and organize the other girls in a small group to exclude
Mean girls.
one of the other girls, and then all of a sudden it switches around and somebody else is out at another time. And bullying often occurs between friends and is very destructive to their relationships. It's very hurtful to the person who's on the receiving end of it. And these roles are quite variable. And in our longitudinal research, we found that some children who started out bullying a year or two later might be victimized. Similarly, children who were victimized and didn't have help in being safe in their peer group often started bullying.
I'm going to make an admission here. I was having a conversation with my best friend who I've known for 30 years about bullying. And I said, well, you know, who was the bully in our group? She said on the other line of the phone, you were. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. And so it made me think, Tony, you know, I was a popular kid. I was pretty playful, all these things. Arguably, I would think that I don't sort of fit the image of a typical bully, or do I?
Well, one of the things we know about bullies, and this ties into bullies and victims, so these are children who are purely bullies and aren't victimized, is that they tend to have average or better social skills. They tend to have better understanding of people's minds. They tend to be rated as very popular, although they're not well liked. So you can be respected, but not well liked. And they don't show a lot of the deficits that we typically associate with characters like, say, Nelson Muntz from The Simpsons. So these are children who are socially skilled, and because of the predispositions and the right environment, are choosing to engage in a behavior that's getting them something. So whether or not somebody is a bully, I think you'd have to look at intent, as well as what's the people's responses to it. So it's hard to say whether or not your friend was accurate or not, but I would say if there's a perception, there probably was. You may be throwing around your weight or your popularity to try and get some of the things that you wanted that maybe she didn't.
Fair enough. Point taken. Okay, Deborah picked up on this earlier. I want to talk, as we move through the conversation, as I mentioned, about the advent of technology and internet. I want to touch on it a bit with you, though, Tony. Has the internet, the advent of technology, texting, all those things we talk about when we talk about modern day bullying, has it changed bullying in any substantive way, or is it just added tools to the bully's toolkit?
I would tend towards the second answer, with the caveat that what online cyberbullying really does effectively is it makes it very hard to catch the bully. And that's something that you can see in social bullying. Spreading rumors, et cetera, is hard to catch, but at least there's people physically doing it. When you do it on the internet, it's very difficult to track that person down. And of course, you can do a lot of damage in a widespread area, and you can chase the child out of the school. So these are things that were more difficult to do with previous forms of bullying that cyberbullying has made much easier. So in some ways, it's potentially much more dangerous.
And it's made it easier because, you know, when I was a kid, no internet, right? If you were going to bully someone, you were going to have to walk up to them, look them in the face, and bully them. And that's, I would argue, a little more difficult than anonymously sitting at a keyboard and typing away.
Yeah. There are some differences, though, between traditional forms of bullying and cyberbullying. And one is that cyberbullying invades children's lives 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I raised 3 children when there wasn't the internet and these messaging programs. And I could hear them talking on the phone. I could see whether they were upset. I could pursue that and do conversations afterwards. We as adults are not in children's virtual worlds. These are real relationships they're engaged in. They're very important to them at a time of life when relationships are hugely important. And yet adults aren't there to monitor it. And there aren't the kinds of rules. There aren't the kinds of normal feedback mechanisms that, as you were mentioning, you get when you have to walk to somebody face to face and you look at the impact of your behavior. And in cyberspace, you just send a message out and circulate it to thousands, and it's so hurtful.
And it's intense.
And
It's relentless,
yeah.
24/7. You wake up in the morning, you check your phone, there it is,
Exactly.
being bullied. You go to bed, there it is. Last thing you do is check your computer. Your phone beeps all night, and there you are waking up in the middle of the night looking at your phone, and someone sends you a nasty message. Okay, so given all of that, is it fair for some people who do this to blame the technology? Is it fair to say, well, this is just the way things are now, modern technology, and that's the problem? That's the issue that we're dealing with bullying today.
I don't think it's about the technology, because the same children who bully in traditional ways bully using this new technology. I think it's about teaching children what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, how you create a healthy relationship, how you think about another person's perspective and your impact on that. And these are skills that they'll need in adolescence when they start to develop romantic relationships. They'll need in the workplace. They'll need to sustain a marriage. They'll need to be parents. We really need to teach children how to get along with others.
I know that there's a mother or father out there watching saying, I do all those things and yet my kid's still a bully. So quit blaming me because I teach my kid all the right things.
And it's about then your child's experience in the peer group. So when we did our early research videotaping on the school playground, we can see that this is very much a social event, and there's a lot of reinforcement for the children who bully. 85% of the time, other children are standing around, and the power dynamics in the peer group reflect the power dynamics between the two children involved. So there's lots of reinforcement for the child who has power and is bullying, lots of attention, and very limited attention to the child who's being victimized.
Okay, you two, I'm going to get you to hold on for a couple of minutes because I want to bring someone else into our conversation. Emma Teitel is a columnist with Maclean's magazine. Hello.
Hello.
Okay, I want to start with something that you wrote in Maclean's last month. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read a little chunk of it. Here's what you wrote. I came of age on the internet. Like 43% of kids today, I was a victim of cyberbullying, though I didn't really think of it as such because the term hadn't been invented yet. I was also undoubtedly a cyberbully. My parents, God bless them, had no idea what I was doing. So for those of us that didn't grow up on the internet, Emma, give us a sense of the social landscape there for teens. How different was that from how you and your friends interacted, say, versus the mall or in the schoolyard?
Well, I think that there's a large part of this that the media hasn't really touched on yet, and that I haven't heard from any of the anti-bullying campaigns, which is that a lot of this has to do with celebrity culture. I think of social media as a personal tabloid, sort of like Us Weekly or Entertainment Tonight, only it's not celebrities, it's people you know. So if you go onto Facebook or Instagram or Formspring, another popular bullying destination, what do? You look at pictures of people, you judge them, you talk about them, almost as you would look at a tabloid. So I think that that's what's changed a lot in terms of bullying. I think that we've started to inject celebrity culture into our own social lives, and it's made us crueler as a result. So I actually do blame the technology.
You said, for that quote that I just read, that you were both the cyber bully and the cyber bullied. And we heard from Deborah and Tony about, that same person can be the bully and the bullied. Do you see that sort of happening all over the internet, that you can almost change roles, if I can put it that way, so easily?
Totally, and I think that it's because of that tabloid culture. Like when I was growing up, for example, we had this trend where we would make websites and we would make lists and quizzes. It was almost like Cosmopolitan. So you'd make a quiz like, who's the cutest boy in the class? Who's the ugliest boy in the class? And everybody would take part in this and answer these questions. And when everybody is a part of that culture, it's really hard to identify who is the bully and who is not. It's a bullying culture, essentially. And I think that, I don't know if people still make websites, but I think that a similar trend has sort of
So you wouldn't, offline, let's say, were you a different person? You didn't bring those same sensibilities with you when you went online?
No, because of course online you can be anonymous, which is, I think, what's changed a lot in the bullying landscape is that when you are witnessing a bullying event at school or on the playground, you're a bystander, right? And there's a sort of onus on you to do something, even if you don't. Some sort of sense of social justice might kick in where you say, I should really say something here. But when you're behind a computer screen, that doesn't always happen. So that same sense of social justice that you might have in the real world doesn't kick in because you're anonymous, you're behind a screen, and you don't feel a responsibility to step up.
I want to push you a little bit on that, because arguably you could say, people have a set of morals and a set of ethics that guide them no matter whether they're sitting in front of a computer screen or in the schoolyard. So that sense of social responsibility that might not be as apparent when you're sitting on screen, but you do have morals and ethics that guide all the decisions you do. How is it easy, and I don't want to put you on the spot and say you're a mean person, but I want you to try and help me understand how you were able to sort of separate the two.
Well, you have to also think about it in the context of being a kid and being a teenager, and there are lots of pressures. You want to fit in. It's hard enough when you're actually in a real-life bullying situation to step up and stand up for the victim in that situation. So imagine how much harder it is when you're behind a screen and there really is no force pushing you to do that. Whereas if you're in real life, you might walk away from that situation and think, wow, I'm embarrassed. I just stood there, I did nothing. But when you're behind your computer, nobody sees you. Bullying usually has an audience. On the internet, it has an audience, but it's an anonymous audience, which changes things a lot.
You wrote the article last month, shortly after Canadians and the world came to know what happened with Amanda Todd. And you wrote a lot about that in that article. It was obviously a tragedy, but it was something that didn't shock you. And I want you to tell me and tell the audience, why did it shock you?
Well, her death shocked me. It was really tragic, and I thought that the outpouring of support was amazing. What didn't shock me was the mistake that she made, which is that she took off her top on the internet, a picture was circulated. Things like that happened when I was in high school. I did the same thing. My photo wasn't circulated, to my knowledge. It could be out there somewhere. But it didn't shock me that this was happening, and I thought that the narrative in the media was sort of like, wow, she did this, she made a terrible mistake. And I felt that to be fair to her legacy, I wanted to write something and say, I did this too, and lots of other people are doing it.
So, we can't make the causal relationship between her having pictures on the internet with no top on and ultimately her taking her own life. But it did surprise me reading your article that you said this idea of teenage girls mostly, I think, getting undressed in front of cameras and putting it on the internet is like sort of modern, I think you called it modern day truth or dare.
Yeah. It's not just girls. It was common to see boys doing things on webcam, especially the shyer guys. There would be guys in my high school who wouldn't really look at me walking down the hall, but on MSN Messenger after school, they would turn on their webcams and give us all a show.
Okay, every parent is
Sorry.
taking very deep breaths right now. I want to bring in our final two guests for the evening. In Ottawa, Diane Pacom is professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Ottawa. And via Skype in Hamilton, Henry Giroux, Global Television Network Chair and Professor in English and Cultural Studies departments at McMaster. Hello to you both.
Hi,
Hello.
how are you?
And we want to welcome back Anthony Vogt from Brock University and Deborah Pepler from York University and Emma Teitel from Maclean's Magazine. Okay, here we go, all five of us. Here we are together, six of us, I guess, with me included. I want to play a clip for you all before we proceed. And it sort of sets up our discussion, the discussion we're having tonight. It was sort of the inspiration for our program tonight. It's from The Daily Show, and the backstory is that they've sent their comedian correspondent into the middle of a school election for class president to act as a campaign manager. So take a look at this.
Lauren, why do you want to be president?
Well, I really want to focus on like anti-bullying, so like it just is completely eliminated from the school.
Just said bragging rights.
Would you describe yourself as a popular person?
Not exactly.
Yeah, I would.
If you were an animal, Lauren, what animal would you be?
A cat.
I would probably be a shark.
Good answer. What kind of shark?
A great white.
Great answer. Congratulations, you've got yourself a campaign manager.
Great.
Hey, Lauren, get out. Get out! Shut the door behind you. We are going to crush her.
Crush her.
Okay, I get humor as much as the next person. It's funny, haha, it's all in jest. And using, adult behavior in the context of kids sort of highlights the absurdity of it all. On the other hand, it seems to highlight this culture of mean that, may be growing in society. And it seems to me that I'm hearing a lot of people saying, you know what, I just have permission to be mean these days. That it's okay to be mean, to walk around and be mean. And Henry, I want to begin with you on that one. This one, when you saw that clip, what do you read into it?
Well, I think the discussion about bullying, at one level, often fails to look at a broader constellation of forces that reinforce and reproduce the kind of violence that we see being exhibited in these relationships. I mean, it was very interesting that he used the word shock, because I think it mirrors something that we see everywhere in the culture. We see a culture that basically is no longer about compassion and social responsibility. We increasingly find ourselves in a culture that's driven by a survival of the fittest ethic that kind of mimics reality TV, and in many ways speaks to a growing culture of cruelty that speaks even further to what I call the death of public values and the death of social responsibility. You live in a culture increasingly that enshrines individualism to such a degree that it often translates into a kind of pathological disdain for culture, for community, for compassion, for social relationships. And to abstract the question of bullying from that is, to me, a tragic mistake, because it simply mimics the privatization of bullying. It simply suggests that it's about personal relationships, and at the same time so depoliticizes the issue, so removes it from the larger society, that it doesn't seem to me a fruitful conversation.
Deanne, I know you couldn't see that clip, but I know you could hear it.
Yes.
So pick up on what Henry was just saying. On the one hand, we're deeply concerned about bullying, and we have this culture of meanness, arguably, that says things like, hey, you can, do what you need to get what you want. And then on the other hand, we're saying, hey, don't bully. So kind of, square that circle for me.
Well, actually, as a sociologist, it's very obvious to me that it's the people who are responsible is the adults. They are the ones who have lost control completely of socialization and transmission of values from one generation to the other one. And it's interesting because we are always blaming the kids as being the ones who are mean, who are cruel, and so on and so forth. But we live in a society which is extremely devoid of empathy. There is no empathy. As it was said earlier, individualism is bypassed by narcissism. And we send this message to the kids that in order to survive, you have the right to do whatever you can, to push people aside, to take your place. We are very much fond of leaders and leadership. There is a very, very, very big discussion since the 1960s and 70s about leadership and authority and so on and so forth. I see bullying as a problem of power. and people who have it and people who don't. And it starts really within the family. And we know that the teachers, parents, and community leaders have lost completely their authority and their legitimacy. And this has been taken over by popular culture. So as it was said before, the celebrities, the people who are rude, like I'm thinking about some people like Donald Trump, for instance, who is extremely rich, is extremely powerful, and they become the role models because of the fact that there isn't anything, you know, which is transmitted from the adults to the young people. And specifically, we have two generations, like the millennials who are growing up right now, and the generation before them, which is the Y generation. And they, according to me, they have been brought up in a vacuum, in a complete vacuum. There are no standards, no values, and there is also this disenchanted rapport with life. Like there is no enchantment in their lives. The only enchantment comes from celebrity, from this little power that they can grab left and right, and so on and so forth.
Okay, I want to give everyone a chance to pick up on what Deanna's just said, because she's laid out a lot on the table. Deborah, let me begin with you. What do you hear in that conversation that sits right with you or doesn't sit right with you?
Well, I think both Henry and Diane picked up the issue of values, the important role of adults in socializing children and youth. And we run a national network, the Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network, that brings together researchers and practitioners. And consistent with what Deanne said, we really think the place to start is by helping the adults recognize how absolutely essential healthy relationships are for children's development. And it's our responsibility to ensure that children have the skills they need to interact in healthy ways, and that they have healthy relationships at home and at school and in the community, so they can thrive, because otherwise they don't.
And you're not just talking about healthy relationships between kid and adult. You're talking that they need to observe healthy relationships between adults and adults.
That's right, and in the media as well. You know, our politicians who have attack ads are modeling bullying, you know, absolutely. So they're although it's just a child who's bullying and a child who's victimized with maybe some peers around, they're deeply embedded in our culture, and I agree with both of your guests about that.
Tony, well, you know, we don't often talk about adults and bullying. Let's just be honest. We're always talking about kids and bullying. Are we, though, as adults, sort of talking, you know, both sides of our mouths?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, first, I agree completely with the statement that adults are setting bad role models in many cases. That's a very important aspect of the bullying equation, is that kids learn from adults what's effective. And we can see in the last election cycle here or across the border that bullying behavior works. Now, on the other hand, I would like to argue that we are not necessarily worse off now than we were in the past. Steven Pinker's wrote an excellent book on how violence has declined dramatically. We still see bullying in all other cultures. And in fact, when I go to do my research in a remote rural Caribbean village, it's a very small island, and I would compare it to life in Canada 100 years ago in terms of the lifestyle. Very community-oriented, very village-oriented, and yet we see the exact same kind of bullying that we do here. So I don't think it's a simple absence of cultural values. I think that it's a common cultural value for people to try and strive for what they want, and for some people to use aggressive behavior to get it. And so we have to address that at all levels, rather than just say it's something that's happening now and it's a fault of now. It's a common theme.
Okay, I want to let Deanne come in here, and then I'm going to go to Emma and then to Henry. Go ahead, Deanne.
Yes, it's interesting because I totally agree that bullying and violence among young people always existed, but the bully was not seen as somebody who was powerful. He was seen as someone that had to be castigated. I was bullied because I was wearing glasses in the bus by a girl. And I was really supported, you know, by my teachers, by my parents, because it wasn't something that was cool back then. So I think this is something that has to be taken into consideration. The other thing that I wanted to add, which is very important, is that the kids today live in a rapport with time, which is different. They live in the present, in the moment. moment. There is a very fragmented and ephemeral perception of time. So most of the time, they're not aware of the consequences. It's like you see they're here now, they're bullying someone. They don't see the harm that can be done. And these are changes that we've seen in the last 30 years, 40 years maximum. So yes, there was violence, but the setting that surrounds and rationalizes and explains the violence today, I believe promotes it, if not overtly, covertly.
Okay, Emma, you have, you've been 5 years into the adult world, so are us adults being hypocrites on all of this?
I think a little bit. I think you guys are painting a pretty grim picture. I don't think it's all your fault. I would blame the technology more. I agree with the idea that we are living in a kind of fragmented way right now, in such that every decision you make online is an impulsive one. And before, I was just talking to Tony about this before the show, if you wanted to take a topless picture of yourself and send it to your boyfriend, you'd have to really think about that, or not think about it, but you would have to take it somewhere to get it developed. It would be a lengthier process, but because of the internet and how quickly things happen, most decisions are impulsive ones. But I think that one thing we're not really touching on enough is Rebecca Black. Do you remember Rebecca Black? This was 2 years ago. She was kind of like a nasally 14-year-old girl. She wrote a song called Friday. It went viral, the music video. Do you remember this?
I don't.
The song was like, Friday, gotta get down on Friday. Yeah, so it was a really annoying song, but it was hilarious, fun to make fun of, much like the clip we just saw from the Daily Show. And it went viral, and she was just skewered in the media, everywhere. She was bullied to the point at which she had to leave school. She received death threats. But when we look back at that case, it wasn't one of the big bullying cases. And in my mind, that is like probably the biggest, most widespread, international bullying case in history. But we don't think of it as such. And I think the reason for that is, getting back to the celebrity element, I think that what social media allows you to do is that whenever you use it, you're putting yourself out there, which means you want attention. And I think that we've started to view each other as we view celebrities. And we have very little remorse or good feeling for celebrities when they mess up or do stupid things in the media. We make fun of them. And I think we're elevating regular people to the status of celebrity when they get a little bit or a lot of attention, and it's not healthy.
Henry Giroux, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, what do you make of what you're hearing?
I think to deny the historical specificity of violence is a mistake. I think that we live in a time, particularly since the 1980s, when we've seen a collapse of the social contract. We've seen what I call a hardening of the culture, the emergence of a culture of cruelty, in which social bonds, social relationships, dependencies, misfortunes become the object of scorn and disdain. The stories that a society tells about itself and the way in which it influences its children is a deeply political and pedagogical consideration. And I think not to acknowledge that something has happened since the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan said government is the problem and Margaret Thatcher said society doesn't count anymore, is in fact to recognize that we were on the verge of a moment when we were utterly privatizing every aspect of our lives. I don't believe it's just the technology. Look, that same technology was used in Iran to basically cause a revolution. Why did that happen? It wasn't the technology, it was the values that informed that technology. We live in a world where it becomes impossible to relate private problems to public considerations. So we ultimately blame each other for the problems that we have, and we essentially find ourselves living in a culture in which violence becomes a commodity. When you live in a culture in which the only obligation of citizenship is basically shopping, as opposed to engaging a larger public good, that spells something predatory to me. And it's not a matter of blaming adults, it's a matter of looking at institutions of power and how they work and how they legitimate themselves through particular kinds of public values that allow this sort of thing to continue and to basically take place.
All right, I see heads nodding, I see heads shaking. I don't agree. Tony, you're kind of looking skeptical.
I agree with some of what Henry is saying. Obviously, we can't, and I would never want to say we want to ignore what's happened since the 80s, but some of that is very good. We used to have institutionalized slave days at high school where we had hazing as a form of ritual bullying. The military used to have strong hazing rituals that have since had to be tamed down. Hazing and bullying used to be an institutional part of our lives, that to get somewhere you had to be bullied. And again, when we look at these other cultures where they show these values, very deep communal values, in fact, we still see these same patterns of behavior. So I don't want to deny that what we see within our culture influences our children. It certainly does, from technology to parents to the power structures that we have. But we have to recognize that children are smart and they're going to pick up what is best for them. And they use what's best from them for their environment. And oftentimes, when they have relationship problems, they're going to use bad tools. And I think what we need to do is address the tools that we are giving our children.
All right, Deborah, stick with the cultural context. How much does it matter to this discussion of bullying?
I think it does, and I think in our culture, we need to start having conversations about what's the difference between aggression and assertiveness. You know, assertiveness isn't a strategy to cause harm to another person, but it's a strategy to ensure that you're safe, that your values are upheld, that your rights are upheld, whereas aggression is about to hurt. The other discussion I think we need to have is around competition and aggression. So competition really means to strive together, whereas aggression, again, is the intent to harm. And at a cultural level, I've had numerous business people say, you can't say that I can't be aggressive. I need to be. That's how I survive. Or a boss says, well, I need to bully. How else do I get people to do this? But what we really need those people to do is to use their power positively. And yes, competition is to strive to do your very best and to win, but not at the expense of causing personal harm.
Deanne, it is part of the problem that we don't always use bullying in a sort of pejorative, as a pejorative term or in a pejorative way.
Yes, there is a positive aspect. There is an added value to be aggressive, to be, in your face, like they say in English, and so on and so forth. The other thing that I wanted to underline is the fact that culture, as we said earlier, is a very important dimension in today's reality more than ever. And also, aggression and violence today, most of the time, takes a symbolic form. Right. Especially with the technology, and because of the technology, like people, they express through words, through attitudes, and so on and so forth, something that can be extremely hurtful to somebody else. And with the technology, obviously, this becomes extremely, contaminating. Like the whole life of a person can be destroyed because of this very indirect type of violence. I'm not saying that direct type of violence doesn't exist anymore. The other thing I wanted to add in the discussion, if you permit me to do so, is that again, we're speaking about young people today as being, something very coherent. Most of my work is done on the idea of showing that we have a very diverse, group of people that fit underneath the statistics, between the ages of 18 and 35. And what I find extremely positive and extremely helpful is to see that there, at the same time that we have these people who are seduced by violence, symbolic or otherwise, manipulated by the media and by peer pressure, we have wonderful young people who are the ones, right now, who are, criticizing all those things. I don't see all the young people being equally vulnerable to these very unfortunate, trends. So on one side, we have the ultimate narcissist, dehumanized, selfish, trying, predatory, as we said, trying to use everybody. And on the other hand, you have these wonderful, altruistic people who do more and more work with with other people who need them, people who are very giving, loving, who care about nature, and so on and so forth. So we live in a society which is very contradictory, very divided, very fragmented, and I think this reflects also in the values of our young people today.
Henry, I want to go back to you and just ask you to respond a little bit to what Anthony said just a few moments ago, that, no matter where he goes in the world, this isn't just a modern day since the 1980s phenomenon, that this has been something you can observe in various societies over, umpteen years, umpteen decades, centuries even in different societies. When you hear that, you've sort of made the argument that this is, growing in popularity, if I can put it that way, bullying. Do you take anything of what Tony says, that this is just part of being, pardon me, human beings?
No, I don't take that argument seriously at all. I mean, I think it's an utterly depoliticized historical argument. And I'll give you one example. I mean, when he talks about how things have gotten much better, then points to the military, I find it odd to hear that, because I think when you look at the United States, when you see a country in the 1980s all of a sudden justified torture, and all of a sudden started paramilitarizing its police officers, and all of a sudden you see the rising of the punishing state, in which you have punishment creep seeping from prisons to schools with zero tolerance policies. These are very specific policies that have to be understood within the historical context in which they take place. And I think to simply wash that away is to wash away the political question. I mean, we need to ask ourselves some very serious questions about the structural and ideological forces at work in any society that increasingly legitimate violence as one of the few mediating forces that matter anymore. And I think that what we see, particularly in the United States and increasingly in Canada, is a set of values and a set of institutions that basically diminish questions of social responsibility. Economics is removed from social cost, removed from ethical considerations. We have a new technology that's utterly commodified and commercialized. It's not just about celebrity culture. It's about the commodification of everyday life. It's about creating customers. It's about bypassing parents. It's about carpet bombing kids commercially. It's about corporate power in some way undermining the very social fabric that should be put in place for a democratic formative culture to exist. Look, we know this. We know that the educational force of the culture is far more powerful than anything we have ever seen in the past. So we know that this question of pedagogy, this question of persuasion, this question of teaching machines that are now at work, are shaping kids in a way that often mimic the logic of an extreme market value driven society. There's not much in that logic that speaks to civic literacy. There's not much in that logic that speaks to civic courage. And there's not much in that logic that speaks to social responsibility. And as educators, all of us, we have, it seems to me, two approaches to take. Either at one level, we need to address it in its most strategic sense, creating support groups for kids, providing psychologists, addressing it in schools. But we also need to talk about changing a larger social structure that basically imposes these values on kids. And while there is resistance, as somebody had just mentioned, and people are diverse, and people don't mediate these things in the same way, these are very powerful forces. I mean, violence now has a visibility in its extreme form, from extreme sports to wrestling to everything else, like we've never seen before. It saturates the culture like an electric current because it makes money. It makes money. It has a market. And we need to address that.
Tony.
Well, again, I just would fall back on data. And while I don't disagree that today's society is more individualistic, we have a greater spread of rights than we've had at any time in history. Women's rights, children's rights. The UN Convention for Children's Rights is less than a decade old. We see a second term for a black liberal, at least as far as Americans are concerned, liberal president. And again, when we look at other cultures, I can think of hunter-gatherers such as, say, the Yanomamo, who in culture enshrine violence, where to be a man, you have to literally hit other men over the head with sticks, and the man who has the most scars is the toughest man. We can look at ancient Greece, a culture of violence. We can look at medieval Europe. I'm not denying that modern culture and individualism and commercialism is bad for our children's moral development. But to say that's the only driving cause behind modern bullying, I think, is missing a lot of the elements.
All right, Deborah. Given that our discussion it sort of is pointed towards the conclusion anyway that things like bullying yields rewards more than punishment, right? You got the attack ads, you got one person left on the island. They've been proven to work. So the big question then becomes is maybe we've just reached the limits of civility?
That's an interesting question. Do you know, they might work in that group setting, for sure. Children who are highly skilled, highly socially skilled, and bully increase in popularity in a sort of a social group like that. And politicians who use attack ads might win. But this is not a good strategy for interpersonal relationships. When you think about how to be with a partner, how to be a parent, how to be a co-worker, these strategies of using power aggressively are very destructive in interpersonal relationships. So we really need to step back and think about how do we shape our culture to enable young people to be the kind of people that Deanne was talking about, the kind of altruistic, thoughtful, critical, engaged, socially responsible young people. And it has to do with the way that we interact with them in moment to moment as parents or teachers or hockey coaches. And it has to do with the way we support them in this development.
Okay, Emma. Not to be mean to Deborah, but don't kids just sort of roll their eyes when they hear things like Deborah saying that we need to teach them? Or what's the response?
Well, I haven't been in high school for a while.
Fine.
It's been like 7 years or something. But I
Young
do
people. Can I still
do
consider
think
you a young person?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm fairly young. I do think that kids roll their eyes. I used to roll my eyes all the time. But for example, I'm gay, okay? And when I was in school, they had all of those rainbow triangle things around, and I made fun of them. I would always say, you know, that's so gay. But deep down, I was very glad that they had those rainbow triangles and pink t-shirt days, or, you know, all of those different kind of supportive spirit elements in the community. So I do think that just because kids roll their eyes, that doesn't mean that they don't appreciate that. And it's worthwhile for kids to know that there is a safe space for them wherever they are. So I think we can be dismissive of those campaigns as much as we want to, because kids are dismissive of them so often, but that doesn't mean that they're not working or that they're not doing anything.
All right, Henry, I don't even know if I need to ask you this one, but do you think we've maybe just reached the limits of our civility here?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of reaching the limits. I think it's a matter of new beginnings. I mean, I think that, you know, what do we learn from a society in which we find ourselves awash in a kind of civic illiteracy? I mean, and it's not, as you know, was just suggested, there's a one-shot answer here. The question is, look, what kind of democracy do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to have? What kind of formative culture makes that possible? What institutions do we need to address that might play a central role in a sense, promoting the kind of public values that matter, that allow kids to be able to feel responsible for each other, to engage in modes of social engagement that are compassionate and heartfelt. These are things that we're all going to have to participate in. We've got to develop political and strategic strategies that basically are context-based, that take into consideration the different groups that we're dealing with within the historical moments in which we find ourselves. I mean, context matter, difference matters, visions matter. I mean, what kind of vision should drive the discussion on bullying? How do you talk about the relationship between what kind of society we want to live in and what the measure of a democracy might be, and what where what it means to address the question of bullying within those larger kinds of questions?
Deanne, go ahead.
Yes, it's very interesting when Henry spoke about democracy. Democracy is a work in progress, and I believe that right now we are negotiating again the rules of democracy, the people who are included, excluded, and so on and so forth. So I see it as being exactly that. It's a transitional moment. Some type of civility has disappeared, or a sort of civility, a definition of civility has disappeared. But I can see in my optimistic moments, the emergence of new social forces, of new ways of relating, and new ways of solidarity, of building solidarity. And in my worst moments, as I said, always there is apocalyptic vision and a Renaissance vision, and I think they coexist. But the interesting thing and the important thing, it's exactly what we're doing, which is part of the democratic process, is talking about it. We are talking about it. We are contributing, you know, in debunking some myths, in exploring some ideas, and this is part and parcel of the democratic process. The last thing I wanted to add is that, unfortunately, because of the overwhelming sensationalism that exists today, because of the media, because of you know, whatever logic exists in our society, we tend to always emphasize the violence, the negative aspects of youth. I really would like to also emphasize the amazing creativity of our young co-citizens. There is so much happening, you know, today, but it's not as sexy, it's not as exciting, than, unfortunately, in a morbid way, than when we show the destruction, the ugliness, and so on and so forth.
Okay, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask everyone to hop in on this one. I want to start with you, Tony. At the beginning of our conversation, you said, looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, bullying is something that's really been around forever, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily want it to be around any longer. So help me out. I know I'm asking for little trite answers to a very big question, but I want to ask each one of you, what are one or two strategies you think, because there have been so many bandied about over the months, politicians saying we need a national strategy to address bullying. I just want to ask each one of you, one or two things that you think is actually going to help our society address this very big issue.
Well, we know actually a fair bit of what works. I think there's a three-pronged approach that we could take to tackle bullying. First is to address the bystanders. And these are the people who give implicit support by standing by, encouraging the bully, or just doing nothing. And we know from research from Finland that if you tackle these people who don't have a horse in the race, so to speak, it makes a difference. You can cut it down. We know from research from Norway that if you change societal values and you really hit hard on bullying in terms of punishment, that also drops bullying because you're raising the cost of being a bullying. Unfortunately, neither one works perfectly. And I think the third thing that we need to add is add a carrot. So the grade 12 who's picking on the grade 10s to show how tough he is getting popularity. But we know from research that the better way to get popularity is to be strong and nice. So instead, teach that grade 12 to stand up to grade 11s who are picking on grade 9s. They're still showing how tough they are, how strong they are, but they're doing it in a pro-social way that works out even better for getting what they want. So change the culture and the bystanders, punish bullying, and give bullies alternatives.
Okay, we got 2 minutes. I'm going to ask everyone to keep their answers very short. Deborah.
We don't understand bullying as a school problem. It's much more a societal problem. And so right now with our network, we're starting to talk to the federal government about this as a public health issue, because children who don't grow up in healthy relationships develop many, many mental and physical health problems.
Okay, Emma.
I'm not an expert on bullying, and I haven't done any research, but I kind of agree with what you were saying there about the bystanders, because I think that especially when it comes to cyberbullying, so much of why it continues to persist is because of the anonymous bystanders. So I think if there was some sort of initiative or campaign to encourage kids to speak out even when they are anonymous, to say that's wrong, even if it is anonymous, I think that would make a difference.
Okay, Henry, keep it short. What can we do?
I think it's best to recognize that bullying is not just simply an individual problem, it's a social issue. I think we need to support those social movements that are now taking place on the part of many young people who are employing a language of critique and possibility about changing the structure of a society that allows this kind of thing to take place. Thirdly, we need to connect the question of bullying to the question of inequality. I think that what we often see are the kids who are bullied are the kids who are often seen as disposable, the kids who don't matter. And I think we need to address very, very carefully how those inequitous political, economic, and social relationships contribute to the problem.
All right, Deanne, you get a very last short word. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, develop the empathy and combat narcissism and disconnection. This is part of the problem, and also empower kids. There are so many people and young people specifically who act in a violent way because they feel powerless. So I believe we do this more and more in schools and universities. Really give them more power.
All right, I want to thank all five of you for a very civil discussion tonight on a very important topic. Anthony Volk from Brock University, Deborah Pepler from York University, and Emma Teitel from Maclean's Magazine, all three of them here in our studio. And on the line from the University of Ottawa, Deanne Peckham, and Henry Giroux from McMaster joined us tonight via Skype. Thank you very much, all five of you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.